across the vast expanse of the Andromeda Spiral, where 1,000 alien civilizations bow before the might of the Empire, a single question echoes through the halls of power like a death knell. How did one small human unit accomplish what entire fleets could not? The nobility, beings who have conquered galaxies and enslaved entire species, now huddle in their crystalline palaces, their 6 eyes wide with terror as they whisper the name that has become synonymous with impossible victory: Unit 7 Terra. What you are about to witness is not just a story of war, but a complete reshaping of everything the universe thought it knew about strength, strategy, and the terrifying potential that lies dormant within the species called humanity. This is the account of how 50 humans changed the fate of civilizations, and why the most powerful empire in known space now trembles at the mention of Earth. Prepare yourself for a tale where the impossible becomes inevitable, where the underdog becomes the apex predator, and where the phrase, "never underestimate humanity," takes on a meaning so profound that it will echo through the cosmos for to come. The crystalline spires of Prime pierce the purple sky like frozen screams, their surfaces reflecting the light of 3 suns that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Within the highest tower, Emperor the Conqueror sat upon his throne of compressed neutron matter, his 6 eyes fixed upon the holographic display that showed the impossible. 50 humans, 50 members of a species barely capable of interstellar travel, 50 beings from a backwater planet that the Empire had designated as a minor curiosity. These 50 had just accomplished what the combined might of the war fleet, numbering in the millions of vessels, had failed to do in 3 centuries of conflict. They had broken the defense grid. The Emperor's primary eyes narrowed as he studied the tactical readout. The hegemony had been the Empire's greatest rival, a civilization of warrior philosophers whose defensive capabilities were legendary. They were surrounded by a network of gravitational manipulators, quantum mines, and reality-warping barriers that had repelled every assault the Empire had mounted. The siege had lasted 300 years, with countless fleets reduced to cosmic dust against those defenses. And now, a single human unit designated as Terra 7 had somehow penetrated the grid, disabled the primary defense nodes, and was currently engaged in what could only be described as the systematic dismantling of the most formidable fortress in known space. How? The word escaped the Emperor's throat as a low growl, causing the attending nobles to step back in fear. His secondary eyes swiveled to fix upon Admiral, or the commander who had brought this disturbing news. Admiral Orr, a veteran of 200 campaigns and the destroyer of 17 civilizations, visibly trembled as he activated the detailed battlefield analysis. "Your Imperial Magnificence, our intelligence networks have been monitoring the human unit since they departed their 6 standard months ago. They requested passage through our territory, claiming to be explorers and diplomats." The hologram shifted, showing a modest vessel barely the size of a scout ship. Its design was primitive by Empire standards, using crude chemical propulsion augmented by what appeared to be experimental field manipulation technology. The ship, designated as the Endurance in human script, looked like it had been assembled from scavenged parts and determination. "We granted them passage because their ship posed no conceivable threat," the Admiral continued, his voice growing smaller with each word. "Their weapons were minimal, their shields were practically non-existent, and their crew numbered only 50 individuals. Our computers calculated their threat level as 0.001%. Empress' middle eyes focused on the ship's specifications. By all logical measures, the Endurance shouldn't have been capable of surviving a journey to the edge of space, let alone penetrating their defenses. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The tactical display showed the human vessel moving through the defense grid like it didn't exist, its crude sensors somehow navigating threats that had confounded the Empire's most sophisticated AI systems. "Show me the engagement recordings," the Emperor commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The hologram changed, displaying a view from one of the Empire's monitoring stations positioned at the edge of territory. The massive defense grid was visible as a shimmering network of energy barriers and gravitational anomalies stretching across light years of space. Automated defense platforms the size of moons drifted in perfect formation, their weapons capable of cracking planets in half. Then the Endurance appeared. What followed every principle of military doctrine the Empire had developed over of conquest. Instead of attempting to fight through the defenses or find gaps in the coverage, the human ship simply flew straight at them. But as it approached the first barrier, something unprecedented happened. The gravitational field that should have crushed the vessel instead seemed to bend around it, as if the humans had somehow convinced spacetime itself to let them pass. The quantum mines that should have torn the ship apart at the molecular level simply didn't detonate. The reality-warping fields designed to erase anything that entered them had no effect whatsoever. "Pause it there," the Emperor ordered, his voice tight with disbelief. The recording froze at the moment when the Endurance passed through a barrier that had stopped the Empire's most powerful dreadnoughts. The human ship wasn't using any technology the Empire recognized, wasn't employing any strategy from their vast databases of military tactics. It was as if the laws of physics themselves were being politely asked to step aside. "Your Magnificence," Admiral Orr said hesitantly, "our scientists believe the humans are using some form of probability manipulation. They appear to be making unlikely events become inevitable through methods we cannot comprehend." The Emperor's 6 eyes all focused on the Admiral with terrifying intensity. "Probability manipulation? Are you suggesting these primitives have mastered causal engineering? That technology is theoretical even for us." "Not causal engineering, Your Magnificence. Something else. Something that operates on principles we don't understand. Our analysts describe it as aggressive optimism backed by unreasonable competence." The recording resumed, showing the human ship's continued penetration of the defense grid. At each obstacle, the same pattern repeated. The humans would analyze the threat for a brief moment, then implement a solution that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. They turned a black hole generator into a slingshot. They convinced an antimatter minefield to detonate in perfect sequence, creating a safe corridor. They somehow negotiated with an artificial intelligence that had been designed to be absolutely implacable. "The defenders are in full retreat," the Admiral reported, his voice hollow with shock. "Their fortress worlds are evacuating. The human unit is demanding their surrender in exchange for what they term really excellent trade agreements and cultural exchange programs." Emperor stood from his throne, his massive form towering over the assembled nobles. The neutron matter throne groaned under the shift in gravitational pressure as he began to pace, each step causing minor seismic events in the palace foundation. "Bring me everything we have on this human species," he commanded. "Every scrap of intelligence, every cultural analysis, every biological study. If 50 of these beings can accomplish the impossible, I need to know what we're dealing with." Within minutes, the holographic displays filled with data about humanity. The information painted a picture of a species that should have been utterly unremarkable. They were neither the strongest nor the race in the galaxy. Their technology was generations behind the Empire's capabilities. There was a modest terrestrial planet with no significant strategic resources. They had only achieved interstellar travel within the last century, making them practically infants by galactic standards. Yet as the Emperor studied their history, patterns began to emerge that made his blood run cold. Humans had a disturbing tendency to treat impossible odds as minor inconveniences. Their historical records were filled with accounts of tiny forces defeating massive armies, of individuals accomplishing feats that should have required the resources of entire civilizations, of their species repeatedly defying mathematical certainty through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. "Your Magnificence," one of the court scientists spoke up, "we've discovered something troubling about human psychology. They appear to operate under what they call Murphy's Law and Finagle's Law, but they apply these principles in reverse." The Emperor's attention fixed on the scientist. "Explain." "Where other species acknowledge that anything that can go wrong will go wrong, humans have somehow convinced themselves that anything that can go right will go right, especially when they need it most. They've weaponized hope itself." The implications hit the Emperor like a collapsing star. A species that could manipulate probability through sheer force of will, that could make the impossible seem routine, that treated the laws of physics as suggestions rather than absolutes. And there were billions of them on there, with who knew how many more scattered across their growing sphere of influence. "Admiral," the Emperor said, his voice carrying a note of urgency that hadn't been heard in the palace for centuries, "what is the current status of our relations with Earth?" Admiral Orr consulted his data pad, his hands trembling slightly. We classified them as a protectorate species, Your Magnificence. They're currently listed under our standard colonization protocol, scheduled for annexation once they achieve sufficient technological development. The silence in the throne room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic pulsing of the palace's quantum generators. The assembled nobles watched their emperor, waiting for his response to this revelation. The most powerful being in known space was contemplating the fact that his empire had just declared its intention to conquer a species that was currently redefining the meaning of military impossibility. "Cancel the annexation protocol," the emperor said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Immediately, and open diplomatic channels with Earth, full honors, complete sovereignty recognition, and send them our standard friendship package." "Your Magnificence," Admiral or asked, uncertainty clear in his voice. "Admiral," the emperor said, turning to face the military commander with all 6 eyes. "When 50 humans can do what our entire fleet could not, we need to very carefully reconsider our approach to their entire species. I will not make the same mistake the hegemony is currently making." As if summoned by his words, a priority alert chimed through the palace communication system. The holographic displays immediately shifted to show an incoming transmission from the human vessel Endurance, currently broadcasting from the heart of space. The image that appeared was almost anticlimactic in its normalcy. A human female, appearing to be in her middle years by their species standards, wearing what looked like a simple blue uniform. Her expression was friendly but determined, and her eyes held a quality that the emperor found deeply unsettling. They were the eyes of someone who had never truly believed that failure was an option. "Greetings to the Empire," the human said, her voice carrying clearly across the light years. "This is Commander Sarah of the Earth vessel Endurance. We've just concluded successful negotiations with the hegemony, and they've expressed interest in establishing peaceful trade relations with your empire. We're hoping you might be interested in serving as mediators for the initial talks." The emperor stared at the image, processing the implications of what he was hearing. The humans hadn't just broken the unbreakable defense grid. They had somehow convinced the to abandon 3 centuries of warfare and enter into peace negotiations. And now they were offering to help broker that peace with the Empire. "Also," Commander continued with what appeared to be a slight smile, "we've heard wonderful things about crystalline architecture, and several of our cultural specialists would love to arrange an art and design exchange. We have some ideas about human engineering techniques that might complement your aesthetic sensibilities beautifully." The transmission ended, leaving the throne room in stunned silence. Emperor looked around at his assembled nobles and military commanders, beings who had conquered galaxies and crushed civilizations without a second thought. Every single one of them was staring at the now-empty holographic display with expressions of pure bewilderment. "Your Magnificence," Admiral or said slowly, "what are your orders?" The emperor considered the question carefully. In the span of a single day, everything he thought he understood about power, strategy, and the nature of strength itself had been fundamentally challenged. A species that his empire had barely noticed had just reshaped the political landscape of an entire sector, and they were offering to help them redecorate while they did it. "Send a response," he said finally. "Accept their offer of mediation, accept their offer of cultural exchange, and Admiral." "Yes, Your Magnificence." "Start drafting a comprehensive non-aggression pact with Earth. Something ironclad, permanent, and absolutely unbreakable. If there's one thing I've learned today, it's that we never, ever want to be on the opposing side of human, aggressive optimism." As the nobles began to file out of the throne room, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed, the emperor remained on his throne, staring at the tactical display that still showed the impossible. 50 humans had changed everything, and somehow the most terrifying part wasn't what they had done. It was the growing suspicion that what they had accomplished was just a typical Tuesday for their species. 3 weeks after the impossible became routine, the Imperial Palace of Prime had transformed into something resembling a war room crossed with a xenobiology laboratory. Every available surface was covered with data about humanity, their technology, their culture, and most disturbingly, their complete psychological profiles. Teams of the Empire's finest scientists, strategists, and intelligence analysts worked around the clock, trying to understand how a species barely out of their technological infancy had fundamentally altered the balance of power in 3-star systems. Emperor stood before a massive holographic display showing the current state of what the humans cheerfully called the situation. The ancient enemies who had been locked in brutal warfare for 3 centuries were now engaged in what appeared to be the galaxy's most enthusiastic cultural exchange program. Trade ships moved freely between territories that had been no man's lands for generations. Joint research stations were being established. They had even started adopting human terminology, referring to their former enemies as the neighbors we just hadn't properly met yet. Your Magnificence, Chief Analyst Eth approached with a data pad clutched in his forearms. We've completed our psychological evaluation of the human negotiation techniques. The results are unprecedented. The Emperor's 6 eyes turned toward the analyst, who had the distinction of being the Empire's foremost expert on alien psychology. Eth had broken the will of entire species through careful manipulation of their cultural weaknesses and psychological vulnerabilities. If anyone could explain how 50 humans had accomplished the impossible, it would be him. Present your findings, the Emperor commanded. The holographic display shifted to show a complex psychological matrix. But instead of the usual predictable patterns of fear, aggression, and submission that characterized most species, the human psychological profile looked like someone had fed a quantum computer a mixture of pure optimism and calculated insanity. Your Magnificence, humans operate under a set of psychological principles that appear to violate the basic laws of cognitive behavior, Eth began, his voice carrying a note of professional bewilderment. They possess what they call suspension of disbelief, which allows them to temporarily ignore the impossibility of their circumstances while they work toward solutions. The Emperor studied the data, noting patterns that made no logical sense. Elaborate. When faced with an impossible situation, most species will either surrender or engage in futile resistance until they are destroyed. Humans, however, seem to enter a psychological state where they acknowledge the impossibility of their situation and then proceed anyway. They call it working the problem. A new display appeared, showing recordings of the human team aboard the Endurance as they approached the defense grid. Instead of the expected fear or desperate bravado, the humans appeared to be treating the encounter like a particularly interesting puzzle. Their conversations, intercepted and translated by Imperial intelligence, revealed a mindset that was almost incomprehensibly pragmatic. You see here, Eth highlighted a section of the recording, when they encountered the gravitational anomaly field, their chief engineer simply stated, "Well, that's problematic," and immediately began calculating alternative approaches. No panic, no despair, just professional interest in solving the problem. The Emperor watched as the human engineer, a woman named according to the intelligence files, calmly worked through calculations that would have sent most species fleeing in terror. She was treating a weapon capable of tearing apart space-time itself as if it were a particularly stubborn piece of machinery that needed the right approach to fix. But that doesn't explain how they actually solved these problems, the Emperor said. Positive thinking alone doesn't negate physical laws. That's where it gets truly disturbing, Your Magnificence, Eth replied, manipulating the display to show a breakdown of human problem-solving methodology. Humans have developed what they call lateral thinking to an art form. When confronted with an impossible direct solution, they don't try to overcome the obstacle. Instead, they redefine the problem until the solution becomes obvious. The display showed the human approach to the gravitational anomaly field. Instead of trying to fight through the crushing forces or find gaps in the coverage, they had somehow convinced the field generators that their ship was actually a piece of space debris that should be ignored. The technique was so simple it was brilliant, so obvious it was invisible, and so effective it was terrifying. They turned off the safety protocols? The Emperor asked, studying the technical readout. Not exactly, Your Magnificence. They convinced the automated systems that their ship belonged to a class of objects that the safety protocols were designed to protect. The gravitational field started treating them as something to be carefully guided rather than destroyed. The implications were staggering. It suggested a level of technological understanding that went beyond mere engineering skill. The humans had somehow developed an intuitive grasp of system psychology, the ability to understand not just how technology worked, but how it thought. Show me the negotiations, the Emperor ordered. The hologram shifted to display the interior of what appeared to be a diplomatic chamber, a crystalline cavern deep within their fortress world. The delegation sat in their traditional circle of authority, their massive forms radiating the confidence that came from 3 centuries of military superiority. Across from them, looking almost comically small in comparison, sat 5 humans at a simple metal table they had apparently brought with them. The lead negotiator was Commander herself, and she was doing something that every principle of diplomatic protocol the Empire had ever encountered. She was being completely honest. "We're explorers," she was saying to the assembled warlords, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "We came here because we heard you two were having a really long argument, and we thought maybe we could help you sort it out. We're pretty good at that sort of thing." The Supreme Commander, a being whose very presence could cause stars to dim with fear, stared at the small human with what appeared to be complete confusion. "You came here to help us. You realize we are at war with the—" "Oh, absolutely," Commander replied with a bright smile. "That's exactly why we wanted to help. Wars are terrible for everyone involved. They're expensive, they're destructive, and honestly, they're just really inefficient ways to solve problems." What followed was the most bizarre negotiation session in recorded galactic history. Instead of the usual diplomatic dance of threats and concessions, the humans simply asked what they actually wanted. Not what they were fighting for, not what their strategic objectives were, but what they genuinely wanted to achieve. The answer, it turned out, was surprisingly simple. They wanted to be left alone to pursue their philosophical studies and cultural development. The centuries of warfare had begun as a defensive response to imperial expansion, but had become a self-perpetuating cycle that was preventing them from achieving their actual goals. "So you don't want to conquer the Empire?" Commander asked. "Conquest is philosophically antithetical to our core beliefs," the Supreme Commander replied. "We seek knowledge and understanding, not dominion over others." And they want to expand their territory and influence, but they've been stuck in this expensive war that's draining their resources without giving them anything useful in return, Commander continued, consulting what appeared to be notes written on actual paper. "So you're both fighting to prevent the other from doing something neither of you actually wants to do." The silence that followed this observation was profound. The Emperor, watching the recording, felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries, the sensation of having missed something completely obvious. "What did you propose?" the Supreme Commander asked, and for the first time in the recording, his voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "Trade agreement," Commander said simply. "You've got incredible philosophical and theoretical sciences. They have amazing practical engineering and resource management. You're both spending enormous amounts of energy fighting each other when you could be teaching each other. Think of the advances you could make if you were collaborating instead of competing." The human negotiations had continued for 3 days, during which the participants had apparently shared meals, exchanged cultural stories, and discovered that they had far more in common than either side had realized. The final agreement had been signed over what the humans called a potluck dinner, where each species had contributed dishes from their respective cultures. "Your Magnificence," Eth said as the recording ended, "the humans didn't defeat the defense grid through superior technology or military force. They defeated it by asking it politely to let them pass, then convinced though that their entire reason for building the defense grid in the first place was based on a misunderstanding." Emperor stood in silence for several moments, processing this information. His empire had spent 3 centuries, countless resources, and the lives of billions of soldiers trying to overcome the defenses through brute force. 50 humans had accomplished the same goal with conversation and a shared meal. "What does this tell us about their military capabilities?" he asked finally. "That's the truly terrifying part, Your Magnificence," Eth replied. "We don't think they have any, not in the conventional sense. Their ship mounted basic defensive systems and minimal weaponry. Their soldiers carried equipment that would barely qualify as adequate for planetary defense, let alone interstellar warfare." The Emperor's 6 eyes narrowed. "Then how did they penetrate defenses that stopped our entire fleet?" "Because they weren't trying to penetrate the defenses, Your Magnificence. They were trying to understand them. Every system they encountered, they approached with curiosity rather than hostility. They asked questions. What is this for? How does it work? What is it trying to protect? And when they understood the answers, they simply explained to the systems that they weren't a threat." A new display appeared, showing technical readouts from the human ship's passage through the defense grid. The readings were unlike anything the Empire had ever seen. Instead of the typical energy signatures of weapons fire and shield impacts, the scanners showed what could only be described as conversations. The human ship had somehow established communication protocols with automated defense systems and convinced them to stand down. "They talk to the machines?" the Emperor asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Not exactly, Your Magnificence. They understood the machines. Human artificial intelligence development follows a fundamentally different model from our own. Where we create AI systems to serve specific functions, humans create AI systems to think and learn. Their ship's computer wasn't just calculating optimal attack vectors or defensive positions. It was genuinely curious about how the technology worked." The implications were staggering. The Empire's approach to artificial intelligence focused on creating tools of specific function. The humans, apparently, had created artificial minds that shared their species' fundamental characteristics: curiosity, optimism, and an almost pathological inability to accept that problems couldn't be solved. "Your Magnificence," Admiral Orr's voice cut through the analysis as he entered the chamber. "We've received another transmission from the human delegation." The holographic display immediately shifted to show Commander, this time broadcasting from what appeared to be a cultural center. Behind her, humans were engaged in what looked like the galaxy's most unlikely book club, discussing philosophical texts while sharing what appeared to be coffee and various crystalline beverages. "Greetings again to the Empire," Commander said with her characteristic warm smile. "They have agreed to establish formal diplomatic relations with your Empire, and they're very excited about the possibility of trade agreements. They've also extended an invitation for scholars to participate in their philosophical academies, which apparently have some incredible libraries." The Emperor stared at the image, watching as a philosopher gestured enthusiastically while explaining something to a human engineer, who was nodding and taking notes with obvious fascination. "Additionally," Commander continued, "we've been discussing some fascinating engineering possibilities that could benefit all three of our civilizations. The gravity manipulation technology, combined with crystalline architecture and human materials science, could lead to some really amazing construction projects. We're thinking space habitats, but like really nice ones." The transmission paused, and Commander's expression grew slightly more serious. "I should also mention that we've sent word back to Earth about our success here, and there's been quite a bit of excitement about establishing formal diplomatic relations with both your civilizations. The International Space Cooperation Council is already preparing a proper diplomatic mission, and I believe they're planning to send significantly more than 50 people." The transmission ended, leaving the throne room in contemplative silence. "How many humans are there, Admiral?" the Emperor asked quietly. Admiral Orr consulted his data pad with hands that trembled slightly. "Current estimates suggest approximately 12 billion on there, Your Magnificence, with several million more distributed across their colonial territories." The Emperor calculated rapidly. If 50 humans could accomplish the impossible, what could 12 billion achieve? The question was both fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. "Your Magnificence," Ed interjected, "there's one more thing. We've been analyzing human cultural patterns, and we've discovered something significant about their approach to conflict resolution." "Yes. They don't appear to believe in zero-sum scenarios, where most species view conflict as a situation where one side must lose for the other to win. Humans consistently seek solutions where everyone benefits. It's not just naivety or idealism. They've successfully applied this principle across their entire historical development." The Emperor considered this information. A species that refused to accept that conflicts required losers, that approached every problem with the assumption that mutually beneficial solutions existed, and that had the demonstrated ability to make impossible things happen through sheer determination and creative thinking. "Draft a message to Commander," the Emperor decided. "Accept their proposals for trade agreements and cultural exchange. Invite their diplomatic mission to visit Prime with full honors. And Admiral." "Yes, Your Magnificence." "Start preparing accommodations for a very large number of guests. Something tells me that humanity's idea of a proper diplomatic mission is going to be just as surprising as everything else they've done." As the assembled officials began implementing these orders, Emperor remained in the throne room, contemplating the fundamental shift in the galaxy's balance of power. The Empire had built its success on the principle that superior force could overcome any obstacle. Humanity, it seemed, had built their success on the principle that every obstacle was just a problem waiting for the right solution. The most unsettling part wasn't that the humans had proven more effective than the Empire's military might. It was that they had made it look so effortless, so obvious, so ridiculously simple, that the Emperor was beginning to wonder why his civilization had never thought to try asking nicely before resorting to conquest. The age of human diplomacy, he realized, was about to begin, and somehow that prospect was both more promising and more terrifying than any military threat the Empire had ever faced. The arrival of the human diplomatic mission to Prime began exactly as Emperor had learned to expect from humanity, with something that should have been impossible becoming absolutely routine. The Imperial sensors detected the approaching human fleet while it was still 3 star systems away, and the readings immediately caused panic throughout the palace's military command center. Where the Empire's scouts had been expecting a single diplomatic vessel, possibly escorted by a few support ships, the sensors showed a formation of over 200 human vessels approaching in perfect coordination. "Your Magnificence," Admiral Orr reported, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "The human fleet is unlike anything in our databases. They're not using any recognizable military formation, their ships don't match any known design patterns, and their energy signatures are completely inconsistent with standard propulsion systems." Emperor studied the tactical display with all 6 eyes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The human ships were indeed unlike anything in Imperial experience. They varied wildly in size and configuration, from massive vessels that dwarfed Imperial dreadnoughts to tiny craft that barely registered on the sensors. Some appeared to be traditional spacecraft, while others looked like they had been designed by artists rather than engineers. "Are they armed?" the Emperor asked. "That's the peculiar part, Your Magnificence. Our scanners can't detect any weapons systems whatsoever. No gun turrets, no missile launchers, no energy cannons. Several of the ships appear to be carrying what our computers classify as agricultural equipment and recreational facilities." The Emperor's middle eyes focused on the sensor readouts. The human fleet's composition was baffling. Along with what appeared to be diplomatic vessels, there were ships that seemed designed for scientific research, others that looked like mobile manufacturing facilities, and several that classification entirely. One vessel appeared to be entirely devoted to what the computers identified as entertainment production equipment. "Your Magnificence," Chief Analyst Eth approached with his usual collection of data pads. "We've received a communication from the human fleet. They're requesting permission to establish what they call a temporary cultural exchange campus in orbit around Prime." "A what?" "According to their message, the human diplomatic mission includes not just diplomats, but scientists, engineers, artists, teachers, chefs, musicians, and what they describe as professional enthusiasm coordinators. They want to set up orbital facilities for cultural and technological exchange, while the formal negotiations take place." The Emperor stared at the data, processing the implications. The humans weren't just sending diplomats. They were sending an entire civilization's worth of representatives, each apparently eager to share their knowledge and learn about culture in return. "How many humans are we talking about?" he asked. "Approximately 50,000, Your Magnificence." The throne room fell silent except for the humming of the palace's quantum generators. 50,000 humans, each apparently possessing the same impossible competence that had redefined galactic politics just weeks earlier. "Grant them permission," the Emperor decided, "but maintain full sensor monitoring and prepare defensive measures." "Your Magnificence," Admiral Orr said carefully, "what defensive measures could possibly be effective against a species that defeated the defense grid by asking it nicely?" The question hung in the air like an indictment of everything the Empire thought it knew about power and protection. Before the Emperor could respond, another priority alert echoed through the palace communications system. The holographic display activated to show Commander, now broadcasting from what appeared to be the bridge of a much larger vessel than the modest Endurance. Behind her, the Emperor could see humans working at stations alongside beings he recognized as technicians and several species he didn't recognize at all. "Greetings to Emperor and the people of Prime," Commander said with her characteristic warm professionalism. We're absolutely thrilled to be here, and we want to thank you for allowing us to establish our orbital campus. We've brought some really exciting things to share. The camera angle shifted to show the interior of what could only be described as a mobile city. The Emperor saw vast hydroponic gardens, laboratories filled with incomprehensible equipment, workshops where humans and aliens worked side by side on projects that seemed to blur the line between art and engineering, and social areas where dozens of species mingled in what appeared to be relaxed conversation. We've got cultural exchange programs, technology sharing workshops, scientific collaboration projects, and we've even brought our mobile university, Commander continued, gesturing to indicate the scope of the facilities. Professor Williams from Cambridge is particularly excited to discuss quantum mathematics with your scholars, and our engineering teams are fascinated by your crystalline architecture techniques. The display showed a human in academic robes engaged in animated discussion with a physicist, their conversation apparently requiring multiple holographic displays and what looked like several different mathematical notation systems. Both beings appeared to be having the time of their lives. We've also brought our cultural program, Commander added. Each ship in our fleet specializes in a different aspect of human civilization, and we're hopping to learn about culture in exchange. We understand you have remarkable philosophical traditions and artistic achievements that we'd love to experience. The Emperor found himself staring at what appeared to be a floating city devoted entirely to the pursuit of knowledge and cultural understanding. It was the antithesis of everything the Empire represented, and somehow it was more impressive than any military formation he had ever seen. We'll be sending down our formal diplomatic team within the next few days, Commander concluded. But in the meantime, we wanted to invite any interested citizens to visit our campus. We've got coffee from 12 different worlds, a really impressive art gallery, and our musicians are already working on some fascinating fusion pieces with the cultural delegation. The transmission ended, leaving the Emperor to contemplate the fact that humanity had just casually invited his entire civilization to a party. Your Magnificence, Eth said carefully, our preliminary scans of the human orbital facility show some remarkable technologies. Their power generation systems are unlike anything we've encountered. Their life support capabilities appear to be completely self-sustaining, and their manufacturing facilities seem to be producing new equipment in real time based on the needs of their various projects. Show me, the Emperor commanded. The holographic display shifted to show detailed scans of the human orbital campus. What the sensors revealed was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The human facility wasn't just a collection of ships. It was a fully integrated ecosystem that seemed to be growing and adapting in real time. New structures were appearing as needed. Connecting modules were forming spontaneous bridges between different sections, and the entire complex was reorganizing itself based on the activities taking place within it. They're using what appears to be programmable matter, one of the Imperial scientists reported. But not in any way we understand. Their technology seems to respond to intent as much as instruction. When someone needs a laboratory for a specific experiment, the structure simply provides one. The Emperor studied the readings, noting patterns that suggested a level of technological sophistication that made the Empire's achievements look primitive by comparison. The humans weren't just building with advanced technology. They were partnering with it, creating symbiotic relationships between consciousness and machinery that produced results far beyond the sum of their parts. Your Magnificence, Admiral Orr reported, we're receiving requests from citizens asking for permission to visit the human campus. The number of requests is increasing exponentially. The Emperor wasn't surprised. Word of the human arrival had spread throughout the Empire's communication networks, and the descriptions of their orbital facility had captured the imagination of society. The prospect of accessing technologies and knowledge that the Empire had never encountered was irresistible to a civilization built on the conquest and assimilation of other cultures' achievements. Grant permission for civilian visits, the Emperor decided, but monitor everything. I want to know what our people learn about human capabilities. Over the following days, the Imperial Palace received a steady stream of reports from visitors to the human campus. The accounts painted a picture of a civilization that operated on principles so fundamentally different from the Empire's that they might as well have been from a different universe entirely. Engineers reported that human technology wasn't just advanced, It was intuitive. Human devices seemed to understand what their users wanted to accomplish and adapted accordingly. A physicist had asked to see a particular type of particle accelerator, and the human facility had simply built one from available materials while he watched, tailoring the design to his specific research interests. Artists described collaborative projects where human creativity amplified their own abilities beyond anything they had thought possible. The humans didn't just appreciate crystalline art. They found ways to incorporate quantum resonance effects that made the crystals sing with harmonic frequencies that touched the soul. Most disturbingly for the Empire's leadership, citizens reported that the humans were genuinely interested in them as individuals. Not their technological capabilities, not their strategic value, not their potential for exploitation, but their personal thoughts, dreams, and aspirations. The humans asked questions about philosophy, family structures, artistic preferences, and personal goals with what appeared to be authentic curiosity and respect. "Your Magnificence," Eth reported after a week of analysis, "we're seeing unprecedented psychological changes in our citizens who have visited the human facility. They're returning with increased creativity, enhanced problem-solving abilities, and what our psychologists describe as expanded perspective syndrome." "Is that dangerous?" the Emperor asked. "Not dangerous, Your Magnificence, but profound. Exposure to human thinking patterns appears to unlock cognitive capabilities that we didn't know our people possessed. They're thinking in ways they never thought before, approaching problems from angles they had never considered, and collaborating with each other more effectively than our previous social models predicted." The Emperor pondered this information. The humans weren't just sharing their technology and culture, they were somehow making everyone around them better at being themselves. It was a form of influence more profound than conquest, more lasting than subjugation, and more powerful than any weapon the Empire had ever wielded. "Sir," Admiral Orr announced, "the formal human diplomatic delegation has arrived at the palace. They're requesting an immediate audience." The Emperor straightened on his throne, preparing himself for another encounter with human impossibility. "Send them in." What entered the throne room was not the small group of professional diplomats he had expected. Instead, a procession of 20 humans walked in, each representing a different aspect of their civilization. There were scientists and artists, engineers and philosophers, teachers and students, all dressed in simple but elegant clothing that somehow managed to be both practical and ceremonial. At the head of the delegation walked a woman the Emperor recognized as Dr., Earth's Director of Interstellar Relations. She was an elderly human by their standards, with silver hair and eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had seen the rise of interstellar civilization from its earliest beginnings. "Your Imperial Magnificence," Doctor said, offering what the intelligence files identified as a human gesture of respect. "It is an honor to stand before you and represent the people of Earth in these historic negotiations." Her voice carried a quality the Emperor found both reassuring and deeply unsettling. It was the voice of someone who had never doubted that this moment would be a positive experience for everyone involved. "Welcome to Prime," the Emperor replied, his formal training taking over. "The Empire acknowledges your diplomatic mission and grants you the full privileges of honored guests." "Thank you," Doctor said with a warm smile. "We've brought a small gift as a token of our appreciation for your hospitality." One of the human delegation stepped forward, carrying what appeared to be a simple wooden box. The Emperor's security sensors immediately analyzed the object, finding no threats, no dangerous materials, and no hidden technology. It was, quite literally, just a wooden box. "This box was carved from a tree that grows in Central Park in New York City," Doctor explained, as the gift was presented. "The tree was planted over 200 years ago, and it has watched over the growth of human civilization throughout our development into a spacefaring species. We thought you might appreciate having a piece of our world's history." The Emperor accepted the gift with one of his secondary hands, surprised by the warmth of the wood and the simple beauty of its construction. It was not valuable in any material sense, contained no strategic information, and offered no technological advantage. It was simply a gesture of friendship from one species to another. And somehow, that made it the most powerful diplomatic gift he had ever received. "Doctor," the Emperor said, setting the box carefully beside his throne, "what does humanity want from these negotiations?" The human diplomat's smile brightened, and the Emperor realized he had just asked the question that would define the future of interstellar relations. "Your Magnificence," Doctor said. "We want to be friends. Everything else we figure we can work out together as we go along." The simplicity of the answer was staggering. In a galaxy where diplomacy was traditionally a complex dance of threats and concessions, where every negotiation was a careful balance of power and advantage, the humans had just reduced the entire process to a single fundamental principle: friendship. The Emperor stared at the human delegation, suddenly understanding why 50 of their people had been able to accomplish what his entire military had failed to achieve. They weren't just thinking outside the conventional frameworks of power and conflict. They were operating in a completely different reality, one where the fundamental assumption was that everyone involved wanted the same thing: to build something better together. "Doctor," the Emperor said slowly, "I believe these negotiations are going to be very interesting indeed." As the formal talks began, the Emperor found himself confronting a truth that would reshape his understanding of power, influence, and the nature of civilization itself. The humans hadn't come to negotiate from a position of strength or weakness. They had come to negotiate from a position of hope. And in a galaxy that had forgotten what hope looked like, that might be the most revolutionary force of all. The formal negotiations had been for exactly 17 standard hours when Emperor experienced something unprecedented in his 3-century reign. He realized he was enjoying himself. The conference chamber had been transformed from the intimidating hall of imperial power into something resembling what the humans called a collaborative workspace. The massive obsidian table that had hosted the surrender of countless civilizations was now covered with holographic displays, technical schematics, cultural artifacts, and what appeared to be several different varieties of human beverages that the delegates shared freely with their counterparts. Doctor sat across from the Emperor, her silver hair gleaming under the chamber's crystal lighting as she gestured enthusiastically at a 3-dimensional model that showed potential trade routes between Earth, Prime, and the newly allied territories. Beside her, a young human engineer named was engaged in animated discussion with Admiral or about gravitational drive systems, while a human artist worked alongside an architect to design what they were calling hybrid cultural centers. "Your Magnificence," Doctor was saying, "what we're proposing isn't just a trade agreement. It's a complete reimagining of how interstellar civilizations can work together." The holographic display showed a network that spanned multiple star systems, connecting not just governments but universities, research institutions, cultural centers, and what the humans termed innovation hubs. It was a vision of interstellar society based on cooperation rather than conquest, knowledge sharing rather than resource extraction, and mutual growth rather than zero-sum competition. "The economic projections are remarkable," continued Professor Sarah, a human economist who had somehow managed to make fiscal policy sound exciting. "When you combine manufacturing capabilities with human innovation protocols and theoretical frameworks, the productivity increases are exponential. We're not just talking about trade, we're talking about the creation of entirely new categories of technology and culture." Emperor studied the projections with all 6 eyes, noting details that challenged every assumption his civilization had made about resource allocation and territorial expansion. The human models suggested that cooperation could generate wealth and technological advancement far beyond what any single civilization could achieve through conquest. "But what about security?" Admiral Orr asked, expressing the concern that had dominated imperial thinking for. "How do you maintain strategic advantage without controlling critical resources and territories?" The question sparked what the Emperor was learning to recognize as a characteristically human response. Instead of addressing the question within its original framework, they the fundamental assumptions that made the question seem necessary. "Admiral," said Dr. James Park, a human strategic analyst, "what if strategic advantage isn't about controlling resources, but about making sure everyone has access to what they need to thrive? What if security comes from being part of a network where everyone's success contributes to your own prosperity?" He activated a new display showing comparative analyses of imperial expansion, costs versus collaborative development benefits. The data was staggering. The resources the Empire spent on maintaining control over conquered territories, suppressing rebellions, and defending against rival civilizations exceeded the total value extracted from those territories by a factor of nearly 3 to 1. You're suggesting that conquest is economically inefficient? The Emperor asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Catastrophically inefficient, Dr. Park confirmed cheerfully. The military costs, administrative overhead, and lost productivity from suppressed populations make conquest one of the worst possible investment strategies. Collaboration, on the other hand, multiplies everyone's capabilities while reducing everyone's costs. The human economist pulled up additional data showing projected outcomes for different approaches to interstellar relations. The collaborative model showed economic growth rates that made the Empire's expansion-based economy look stagnant by comparison. But surely, Admiral Orr protested, there are species that would exploit such openness, civilizations that would take advantage of cooperative relationships to gain strategic superiority. Absolutely, Doctor agreed, surprising the military commander. There are always bad actors in any system. The question is, how do you deal with them effectively? She gestured, and the display showed a new model that the humans called defensive cooperation. Instead of each civilization maintaining individual military forces to protect against potential threats, the collaborative network shared intelligence, resources, and defensive capabilities. When everyone in the network benefits from peace and cooperation, everyone has an incentive to maintain peace and cooperation, explained Dr. Park. Bad actors find themselves isolated and outnumbered, facing not just one civilization but an entire network of allies. The Emperor studied the defensive model, noting its elegant efficiency. Instead of the Empire's approach of maintaining massive standing armies to control territories and threaten rivals, the human system created security through mutual interdependence and shared prosperity. This is all very theoretical, Admiral Orr said, though his tone suggested he was finding the theories disturbingly compelling. How do we know it would work in practice? Because it's already working, said Commander, who had just entered the chamber carrying what appeared to be a data pad and a steaming cup of coffee. Sorry I'm late. We've been getting updates from the orbital campus, and I thought you'd want to see what's happening in real time. The holographic display shifted to show feeds from the human orbital facility, now expanded to include dozens of research stations and workshops. The Emperor watched in fascination as mixed teams of humans and worked on projects that seemed to transcend the capabilities of either species alone. That's Doctor from your Imperial Science Academy, Commander pointed to one of the feeds. She's working with our materials science team on what we're calling quantum crystalline composites. The preliminary results suggest we'll be able to create construction materials that are stronger than neutron matter but lighter than hydrogen. Another feed showed artists collaborating with human musicians to create what could only be described as visual symphonies, artistic expressions that engaged multiple senses simultaneously and seemed to produce emotional responses that transcended species barriers. The cultural exchange programs are producing similar results, Doctor added. When different ways of thinking come together, the innovations aren't just additive, they're exponential. The Emperor watched the feeds, seeing his own people transformed by their interactions with human creativity and optimism. Scientists who had been methodical researchers for decades were suddenly making intuitive leaps that advanced their fields by centuries. Artists were creating works that captured emotions they had never experienced before. Engineers were designing technologies that solved problems they had never thought to address. Your Magnificence, Admiral Orr said quietly, our people aren't just learning from the humans, they're becoming more than they were before. It was an observation that cut to the heart of what the Emperor was seeing. The human influence wasn't imposing foreign values or alien concepts on culture. Instead, it was somehow unlocking potential that had always existed but had never been accessed. How do you do it? The Emperor asked suddenly, the question emerging from a need to understand that transcended diplomatic protocol. How do you consistently make everyone around you better than they were before? The human delegation exchanged glances, and the Emperor sensed that he had asked the fundamental question that defined their species' approach to existence. Your Magnificence, Doctor said gently, I think it's because we genuinely believe that everyone has unlimited potential. When you start with that assumption, when you treat every interaction as an opportunity for mutual growth, when you approach every relationship with the expectation that both parties will benefit from the connection, well, it turns out people usually rise to meet those expectations. It's not manipulation or strategy, added Dr. Park. It's just optimism backed by genuine curiosity about what people can achieve when they're supported and encouraged. The simplicity of the answer was, the Emperor was learning, characteristically human. They had apparently built their entire civilization on the principle that people were fundamentally good, that cooperation was more effective than competition, and that every problem contained within it the seeds of its own solution. Doctor, the Emperor said, what would happen if every civilization in the galaxy adopted your approach to interstellar relations? The human diplomat's eyes lit up with what could only be described as delighted anticipation. Your Magnificence, that's exactly what we're hoping to find out. She gestured to activate a new display that showed a galactic map marked with the locations of hundreds of civilizations, many of which the Empire had never encountered. The human exploration and diplomatic corps had apparently been far more active than Imperial intelligence had realized. We've already made contact with 47 different species, Doctor continued. Every single encounter has resulted in successful diplomatic relations and the establishment of collaborative agreements. The network is growing exponentially. The map showed connection lines between civilizations, representing trade routes, cultural exchanges, and research collaborations. What emerged was a picture of galactic society that looked nothing like the traditional model of competing empires and territorial boundaries. Instead, it resembled a vast web of interconnected communities, each contributing their unique capabilities to the growth and development of the whole. The Federation has agreed to share their biotechnology research, Commander added, consulting her data pad. The Silicon Collective wants to establish joint artificial intelligence projects. The ethereal courts are interested in philosophical exchanges, and the Hive Queens have asked for help developing individualized education programs for their offspring. Each addition to the network seemed to multiply the capabilities available to all participants. The Emperor could see that within a few decades, this collaborative approach would produce technological and cultural advances that would make traditional empire building look like a primitive relic of less enlightened times. Your Magnificence, Admiral Orr said, his voice carrying a tone of realization. We could join this network. We could be part of this new model of galactic civilization. But what would that mean for the Empire? The Emperor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The Empire as we've known it would end, Doctor said honestly. But what would replace it would be something far greater, a civilization that's part of a galactic community, contributing to and benefiting from the shared growth of dozens of species. The Emperor considered the proposition. The end of the Empire meant the end of everything his civilization had built over of expansion and conquest. But the beginning of something new meant possibilities that transcended anything they had ever imagined achieving alone. What would you need from us? He asked. Just commitment to the principle of mutual benefit, Doctor replied. Everything else we can figure out together. The Emperor looked around the conference chamber at the mixed groups of humans and working together on projects that were redefining the possible. He thought about the reports from the orbital campus, where his people were discovering capabilities they had never known they possessed. He considered the economic projections that showed collaborative development producing wealth and advancement far beyond what conquest could achieve. And he realized that the humans had done something that no military force had ever managed. They had made the Empire's traditional approach to power look obsolete not through superior strength, but through superior results. Doctor, the Emperor said, rising from his throne with a decision that would reshape galactic history, I believe the people would be honored to join your network. As cheers erupted from both human and delegates, the Emperor understood that he was witnessing the end of the Age of Empires and the beginning of something that had never existed before, a truly collaborative galactic civilization. The most remarkable part was that it had all started with 50 humans who had looked at an impossible situation and decided to solve it by asking if everyone could just be friends instead. 5 years after the signing of the Galactic Cooperative Accord, Emperor stood in what had once been his throne room, now transformed into something that would have been unimaginable to his former self. A collaborative workspace where representatives from 37 different species worked together on projects that spanned entire star systems. The massive chamber buzzed with activity as beings who had once been enemies, rivals, or complete strangers shared ideas, resources, and discoveries, with an enthusiasm that had become the defining characteristic of what the galaxy now called the human effect. Crystalline architects worked alongside ethereal court to design cities that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions of pure imagination. Silicon collective computational matrices collaborated with philosophers to explore questions about the nature of consciousness that were producing artificial intelligences indistinguishable from living souls. "Your former imperial magnificence," came a familiar voice, and turned to see Doctor approaching with her characteristic warm smile, now showing the silver streaks of someone who had spent 5 years in accelerated time dilation, traveling between star systems to establish new diplomatic connections. "Just now," he corrected gently, a change that still felt strange but increasingly natural. The formal structures of imperial hierarchy had dissolved gradually over the past 5 years, replaced by collaborative networks based on expertise, interest, and contribution rather than conquest and submission. "How are the integration projects progressing?" Doctor asked, gesturing toward the various work groups scattered throughout the chamber. "Beyond anything we had imagined," replied, activating a holographic display that showed the current state of what had become known as the Galactic Cooperative Network. The map displayed connections between thousands of worlds, with resource flows, knowledge exchanges, and cultural programs creating patterns that resembled neural networks more than traditional political boundaries. "The economic projections have exceeded our most optimistic estimates," he continued, highlighting data that still amazed him despite 5 years of consistent results. "Joint productivity is up by factors we don't have adequate mathematical notation to express. Crime rates across all member civilizations have dropped to near zero. Technological advancement is occurring so rapidly that our databases can barely track the developments." What the data couldn't capture, but what experienced daily, was the transformation in how entire civilizations thought about existence itself. The people had gone from viewing life as a competition for limited resources to understanding it as a collaborative exploration of unlimited possibilities. Mental health issues that had plagued his species had virtually disappeared. Creative expression had exploded into forms that transcended individual imagination. Even their children were growing up with capabilities that previous generations had never dreamed possible. "The most remarkable development," continued, "is what our psychologists call emergent potential syndrome. When individuals from different species work together on challenging projects, they consistently develop abilities that none of them possessed independently. We're seeing engineers thinking in mathematical frameworks that combine logical analysis with intuitive leaps. Humans are accessing pattern recognition capabilities that approach ethereal court precognitive abilities. They are developing emotional intelligence that enables them to solve philosophical problems through empathic reasoning." Doctor nodded, consulting a data pad that had been upgraded with technology that represented collaboration between a dozen different species innovations. "We're seeing the same thing throughout the network. It's as if intelligent consciousness is naturally designed for collaborative enhancement, and we're just now discovering how to access those capabilities." "How many civilizations have joined the network since our last update?" asked. 43 new member species in the past 6 months, Doctor replied, her smile brightening. "The Crystalline Confederacy decided to abandon their isolationist policies after they saw the philosophical advances they achieved through collaboration. The Machine Collective requested membership after observing the artificial intelligence developments our mixed organic-synthetic teams have been producing. And the Void Dancers. Well, they've never joined anything before, but they sent a formal application along with an offering of what they call spatial music that apparently allows listeners to experience extra-dimensional harmony. The pace of expansion had been staggering. Word of the network's success had spread throughout the galaxy faster than any imperial conquest had ever managed, carried not by military force or economic pressure, but by simple reports of what life was like when entire civilizations worked together toward common goals. "Doctor," said, "I need to ask you something that has been puzzling me for years. How did humanity know that this approach would work? How did your species develop the confidence to base your entire interstellar policy on principles that no other civilization had ever successfully implemented on a galactic scale?" The human diplomat considered the question carefully, her expression growing thoughtful in the way that had learned indicated she was about to say something that would reframe his entire understanding of the situation. "We didn't know it would work," she said simply. "We just knew that what everyone else was doing definitely wasn't working." She gestured toward a historical display that showed the state of galactic civilization before the human intervention. Endless wars between species, resource depletion from competitive exploitation, technological stagnation from knowledge hoarding, and cycles of conquest and rebellion that had persisted for millions of years without producing anything that could be called progress. Humanity spent most of our early history making the same mistakes, Doctor continued. Wars, conquest, competition for limited resources, zero-sum thinking. But we also developed something else: the ability to learn from our mistakes and try different approaches when the old ones stopped working. "But the risk," protested. "What if your collaborative approach had failed? What if other species had exploited human openness and cooperation?" "Then we would have learned something valuable from the failure and tried a different approach," Doctor replied with characteristic human pragmatism. "The worst-case scenario for trying cooperation was that we'd end up back where we started, in a galaxy full of civilizations that couldn't trust each other enough to solve their common problems. The best-case scenario was what we have now, a galaxy where every species' unique capabilities contribute to everyone's growth and prosperity." Contemplated this perspective, understanding more clearly why humanity had succeeded where other civilizations had failed. They had approached interstellar relations not as a problem to be solved through superior force or cunning strategy, but as an experiment to be conducted through trial and improvement. "Your former magnificence," came another voice, and both and Doctor turned to see Commander approaching with what appeared to be barely controlled excitement. "We've received a communication that you both need to see immediately." The holographic display shifted to show a transmission from the edge of known space, where human exploration vessels had been making contact with civilizations beyond the traditional boundaries of galactic society. The image that appeared showed what could only be described as a galactic parliament in session, with representatives from hundreds of species gathered in a vast crystalline chamber that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "This is Captain of the Earth vessel Horizon," came a familiar voice from the transmission. "We've made contact with the Galactic Elder Council, a group of civilizations that have been observing younger species development for millions of years. They've been watching our network's expansion, and they want to make formal contact." The image shifted to show beings of such advanced development that they appeared to be constructed from pure energy, crystallized time, and living mathematical equations. When they spoke, their words seemed to bypass language entirely and communicate meaning directly to consciousness itself. "Young ones of the collaborative network," the Elder Council's representative said, its voice carrying harmonies that suggested vast age and profound wisdom. "We have observed your experiment in cooperative civilization with great interest. In our eons of watching galactic development, we have never seen such rapid advancement in both technological capability and social evolution." Stared at the transmission, processing the implications of contact with beings who had apparently achieved levels of development that made the galaxy's most advanced civilizations look primitive by comparison. "We extend an invitation," the Elder continued, "to join the greater galactic community, a network of collaborative civilizations that spans multiple galaxies and dimensions. Your success in transforming competitive societies into cooperative ones has demonstrated the wisdom and maturity necessary for participation in transgalactic civilization." The transmission paused, and Captain reappeared. "They're offering to share technologies and knowledge that will enable faster-than-light communication across galactic distances, dimensional engineering capabilities, and access to what they call universal consciousness interfaces. The implications for our network's growth and development are, well, they're beyond anything we currently have frameworks to understand." Doctor and looked at each other, both recognizing the magnitude of what they were hearing. The network they had built, starting with 50 humans asking if everyone could just be friends, had apparently attracted the attention of beings who operated on scales they had never imagined possible. "Your former magnificence," Doctor said quietly. "I think we're about to discover that what we thought was a galactic network was actually just the beginning stages of something much larger." As if to confirm her words, the Elder Council's representative spoke again. "The pattern you have established, This transformation of competitive consciousness into collaborative consciousness represents a fundamental evolution in how intelligent life can organize itself. Other galactic networks throughout the universe are requesting guidance in implementing similar transformations. You have become teachers to civilizations that span dimensions. The implications were staggering. Humanity's simple approach to interstellar relations had apparently demonstrated principles that applied not just to individual civilizations or even single galaxies, but to the fundamental nature of consciousness itself across the universe. Doctor said, "When your species first made contact with did you have any idea that you were initiating changes on this scale?" The human diplomat laughed, a sound that carried all the wonder and amazement of someone who had spent 5 years watching the impossible become routine. "We thought we were just trying to help two civilizations stop fighting with each other. We had no idea we were accidentally discovering the basic principles of universal consciousness evolution." And now asked. "Now," Doctor said, her eyes bright with the same optimism that had transformed galactic civilization, "we get to find out what comes next. And somehow, knowing humanity, I suspect it's going to be even more interesting than anything we've accomplished so far." As representatives from across the Galactic Cooperative Network gathered to discuss humanity's invitation to join the greater galactic community, reflected on the transformation his own civilization had experienced. The Empire had once been defined by its ability to conquer and control. The collective was now defined by its ability to contribute and collaborate. The change hadn't made them weaker. It had made them capable of achievements that conquest could never have provided. They had gained not just allies and trading partners, but access to possibilities that no single civilization could have imagined alone. And it had all begun with the most human question possible. What if we just tried being nice to everyone and see what happens? The answer, it turned out, was that the universe had been waiting for someone to ask that question. And now that they had, reality itself was eager to show them what cooperation could accomplish on scales that span not just galaxies, but dimensions of existence that even the most advanced civilizations had never dreamed of exploring. As watched the various species in his former throne room working together on projects that would reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself, he realized that humanity had succeeded in doing something that no amount of military might could have achieved. They had made the universe a better place simply by assuming it could be one. The most terrifying part, he thought with something that might have been amusement, was that they still acted like this was all perfectly normal and exactly what they had expected to happen all along.